Construction workers tearing down an abandoned Kentucky farmhouse in October 1978 broke through a basement wall and discovered something that made them drop their tools and back away slowly. 12 small beds in 2 neat rows, chains bolted to the floor, walls covered in scratched markings, a door that locked only from the outside. No windows. The room had held children who were never meant to leave. Before we dive into the story, if you think the darkest secrets of history deserve to be uncovered, no matter how disturbing the truth, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. These stories exist because someone needs to remember the victims. Also, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, because we're all connected by our need to understand how evil operates in plain sight. Now, let's continue with the story. The photographs taken by Christian County police investigators on October 14, 1978, documented a scene that veteran officers struggled to process. The hidden basement room measured approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, carved directly into the earth beneath what had been the main farmhouse structure. The ceiling was low, barely 6 feet high, creating a cramped, oppressive space that would have felt suffocating even without the evidence of long-term human habitation. Each of the 12 beds was constructed from rough wooden planks, child-sized, arranged with military precision in 2 rows of 6. Beside each bed, an iron ring had been bolted directly into the stone floor, with lengths of chain still attached, showing rust and wear patterns consistent with decades of use. The mattresses had long since rotted away, leaving only wooden frames and the occasional scrap of fabric that might once have been bedding. But what disturbed investigators most profoundly were the walls. Every available surface from floor to ceiling had been covered in scratched markings. Thousands upon thousands of individual lines gouged into the stone and wood with fingernails or perhaps small rocks. The marks appeared to track time. Clusters of 5 lines grouped together in the manner of prisoners counting days. In some areas, the scratches formed crude drawings, stick figures. 2 tall, identical figures standing over smaller figures, symbols that might have been attempts at letters or numbers by hands that had never been taught to write properly. The police report noted that the room had only one entrance, a reinforced wooden door that showed multiple locks on the exterior side. No windows provided natural light or ventilation. A crude ventilation shaft had been cut through the ceiling, but it was barely 6 inches in diameter, sufficient for air circulation, but offering no possibility of escape or even a clear view of the outside world. Property records traced the farmhouse to twin sisters named Evelyn and Estelle Mercier, who had owned the tobacco farm from 1941 until 1958 when they'd apparently abandoned the property. Tax records showed the farm had been sold for back taxes in 1961 to a real estate company that had left the structure vacant for 17 years before deciding to demolish and develop the land. County archives contained surprisingly little information about the Mercier sisters. Birth certificates confirmed they were identical twins born in 1917 to French immigrant parents. But beyond basic vital records, the sisters seemed to have lived without leaving the usual traces of civic engagement. No marriage licenses, no business permits beyond the farm registration, no membership in churches or social organizations. They existed in official documentation as shadows, present but barely visible. An elderly neighbor interviewed during the initial investigation remembered the Mercier farm vaguely. She recalled that the twins kept to themselves, rarely came to town, and spoke French to each other even when English would have been appropriate. She mentioned rumors from the 1940s and 1950s about strange occurrences at the farm, but dismissed most of it as the kind of gossip that isolated people always attracted. When asked if she'd ever seen children at the property, the woman paused for a long moment before saying she'd heard children's voices once coming from somewhere beneath the ground, but had convinced herself it was just the wind playing tricks through the farm's old root cellar. Birth records from Christian County Hospital documented the arrival of Evelyn and Estelle Mercier on March 3, 1917. But the attending physician's notes contained details that made the discovery of the hidden room decades later take on darker significance. The twins had been born conjoined, connected at the chest, and sharing portions of their circulatory system. Emergency separation surgery was performed within hours of birth, a procedure that carried enormous risk in that era and left both infants in critical condition for weeks. Medical literature from the period shows that conjoined twins who survived separation often experienced profound psychological effects. Some researchers documented cases where separated twins reported feeling incomplete, experiencing phantom sensations from their missing sibling, or developing what physicians termed pathological codependency. The Mercier twins appeared to embody every concerning pattern these early studies identified. Hospital records note that the girls' parents, Marcel and Colette Mercier, were immigrants from a rural region of France who had purchased farmland outside Hopkinsville in 1912. Census documents show Marcel listed his occupation as farmer, but neighbors interviewed in the 1980s recalled rumors that the family practiced some form of folk religion that blended Catholic imagery with older traditions brought from the old country. The twins were never enrolled in any school in Christian County. No attendance records exist for them at the local schoolhouse. And when a truancy officer visited the farm in 1928, Marcel Mercier claimed he was educating the girls at home according to French traditions. The officer's report noted the girls appeared healthy, but unusually inseparable, sitting pressed together on a single chair, despite multiple seats being available, speaking to each other in whispers while staring at him with unsettling intensity. A diary discovered in the remains of the farmhouse, written in French by their mother, Colette, provided glimpses into the twins' childhood that explained much about what they would later become. Entries from 1925 described how the girls refused to sleep in separate beds, becoming hysterical if anyone attempted to separate them. They had developed a private language mixing French and sounds that carried no meaning in any known tongue. They moved in synchronized patterns, turning their heads simultaneously, reaching for objects at identical moments, finishing each other's sentences before the other had spoken. More disturbing were Colette's observations about the girls' games. She wrote about finding them in the barn, performing what looked like rituals, arranging dead birds in geometric patterns, mixing their blood together from self-inflicted cuts on their fingers, chanting in their private language. When Colette tried to stop these behaviors, the twins would stare at her silently until she became uncomfortable and left them alone. The diary's final entries, dated just weeks before Marcel and Colette died in a house fire in January of 1941, suggested Colette had become frightened of her own daughters. She wrote that the twins, now 23 years old, had begun talking about becoming one person again, about correcting the mistake of their separation. They spoke of children who would carry both their essences, of recreating what had been torn apart at birth. The fire that killed the parents was ruled accidental by investigators, blamed on a knocked-over oil lamp. But Colette's diary contained a passage dated 2 days before her death. They watch us sleep now. They whisper about blood and unity. I fear what they have planned. Marcel says I imagine things, but I see how they look at us. Not as daughters look at parents, as predators study prey. When the fire investigation report was reviewed decades later, researchers noted details that seemed suspicious in retrospect. The fire had started in the parents' bedroom, while the twins slept undisturbed in a separate section of the house. Both girls emerged without injury, their room untouched by flames despite the intensity of the blaze. They showed no grief at their parents' funeral, standing side by side, staring at the graves with expressions witnesses described as satisfaction rather than sorrow. Military records from the War Department documented the establishment of a prisoner of war camp outside Hopkinsville in April of 1943, designed to house German soldiers captured during the North African campaign. The facility held approximately 800 prisoners assigned to agricultural labor throughout Christian County, filling the workforce gap created by American men serving overseas. Local farmers could request work details through the camp administration, with prisoners transported daily under guard supervision. The Mercier farm submitted its request for labor in June of 1943. The application, preserved in National Archives military files, was notable for its specificity. The twins requested 8 prisoners, all German nationals, preferably from rural backgrounds familiar with tobacco cultivation. What made the request unusual was a handwritten addendum asking that the same men be assigned consistently rather than rotated, claiming continuity would improve work efficiency. Camp Commandant Lieutenant Harold Briggs approved the request without concern. His weekly reports to Regional Command noted that the Mercier farm consistently met production quotas and caused no disciplinary issues. The same 8 prisoners were assigned to work there 3 days each week throughout the summer and fall of 1943, transported in a military truck with a single guard who typically remained with the vehicle rather than supervising work directly. A letter dated September 19, 1943 from Army Chaplain Robert Kellerman to his superior officer contained the first documented concerns about the arrangement. Kellerman had made pastoral visits to various work sites and found the situation at the Mercier farm deeply troubling. He described the twin sisters as living in what he termed unnatural intimacy, sharing the same bed despite the farmhouse having multiple bedrooms. Wearing identical clothing down to undergarments they hung to dry on the same line, speaking to each other in whispers while maintaining unsettling eye contact with the prisoners. The chaplain noted that the prisoners themselves appeared uncomfortable. Several had requested transfer from the detail, though none would specify reasons beyond vague claims that the sisters made them uneasy. When Kellerman pressed for details, one prisoner finally admitted that the twins would stare at them for long periods without speaking, then suddenly laugh simultaneously at some unshared joke. Another mentioned that the sisters had shown them a basement room they dug beneath the farmhouse, telling them it was for storing tobacco, but containing nothing except empty space and strange symbols carved into the walls. Kellerman's letter recommended immediate investigation and possible termination of the work detail. His superior's response, dated October 4th, dismissed the concerns as cultural misunderstanding and reminded the chaplain that maintaining agricultural production was essential to the war effort. The work detail continued without interruption. By December of 1943, guard logs began noting behavioral changes in prisoners returning from the Mercier farm. Men who had been model prisoners, cooperative and resigned to their circumstances, became withdrawn and refused to discuss their work assignments. 2 prisoners requested meetings with the camp psychiatrist, both displaying symptoms of acute anxiety. Neither would explain the source of their distress, claiming only that something wrong was happening at the farm, something they couldn't describe without sounding insane. The camp psychiatrist's notes from these sessions, declassified in the 1990s, recorded fragmented statements about rituals about the twins, cutting themselves and mixing their blood, about being forced to drink something, while the sisters chanted in a language that hurt to hear. The psychiatrist diagnosed both men with war-related trauma and recommended they be reassigned to work details with less isolation. His notes included a personal observation. These men are terrified, genuinely terrified, but of what I cannot determine. They speak of the twin women as though describing witches from old European folklore, beings that exist outside normal human categories. In January of 1944, one of the prisoners assigned to the Mercier farm attempted suicide by hanging himself in the barracks. He survived but refused to speak about his reasons, staring at the wall and whispering repeatedly in German a phrase that translators rendered as, "The children will be monsters." A diary discovered in the farmhouse ruins, written in a mixture of French and English, with passages in the twins' invented language, revealed the philosophy driving what would unfold over the next 4 years. The entries began in March of 1943, shortly after their parents' death, with Evelyn and Estelle writing alternating passages that often completed each other's thoughts mid-sentence. The twins believed their surgical separation at birth had been a violation of natural order, splitting one soul between 2 bodies. They described feeling incomplete, experiencing phantom sensations of the missing connection, dreaming each night of merging back into a single being. But they'd concluded that physical reunion was impossible. Instead, they would create a new generation that carried both their essences unified within individual bodies. Entries from April detailed their plan with disturbing precision. They would select prisoners based on physical characteristics they found desirable, focusing particularly on men who were brothers or cousins. The genetic relationship between fathers was crucial to their design. They believed using related men would create stronger blood connections between the children, binding them together the way the twins themselves had been bound before separation. The diary described their first encounter with the prisoners in explicit detail. Both sisters engaged with the same man, a soldier named Klaus, who they'd learned had a brother also assigned to their farm. The twins performed what they termed a binding ceremony beforehand, cutting their palms and mixing their blood in a cup, adding herbs they'd grown, following recipes from their mother's occult books. They made Klaus drink the mixture while they chanted in their private language, words they claimed would ensure the resulting child carried both their souls merged into one. Over the following months, the pattern repeated with calculated precision. The diary tracked which prisoners were brothers or cousins, documenting their selections with the clinical detachment of a breeding program. The twins always engaged with the same men together, maintaining their belief that simultaneous conception would create children who were more than simple siblings, children who would be as connected as the twins themselves had been before the surgeons tore them apart. Entries from September of 1943 revealed their awareness that the prisoners were terrified. The twins found this amusing rather than concerning, writing that fear would make the blood bond stronger, that terror opened pathways for supernatural forces to enter. They described performing rituals before each encounter, carving symbols into the basement walls, speaking incantations their mother had written in the margins of an old French grimoire they'd found hidden in the attic after the fire. The diary contained detailed observations about which prisoner pairs produced the strongest reactions during the rituals. Two brothers named Jan and Friedrich were mentioned repeatedly as ideal candidates because they'd shown visible distress during the ceremonies, trembling and weeping while the twins chanted. The entry suggested the twins believed suffering was necessary for the magic to work properly, that pain created openings through which their split soul could flow into the children being conceived. By December, both sisters confirmed they were pregnant. The diary entries became ecstatic, describing dreams where they saw themselves whole again, merged within the bodies of their unborn children. They wrote about the basement room they were preparing, how they would raise the children in darkness to heighten their other senses, how isolation would force the siblings to bond with each other completely, recreating the connection that had been stolen from Evelyn and Estelle at birth. A passage dated January 14, 1944, crystallized their intentions with chilling clarity. The children will be what we should have been. 12 bodies carrying 2 souls divided and reunified. They will live as one being distributed across many forms. In darkness, they will learn to see as we see, to know each other's thoughts, to exist in the unity that was taken from us. The doctors who separated us believed they were saving our lives. They were murdering our completion. Our children will correct that mistake. Christian County Hospital records documented the birth of Evelyn's first child on June 7, 1944. The attending physician, Dr. Raymond Thatcher, noted severe congenital abnormalities in his report. The infant boy exhibited cranial malformations, underdeveloped limbs, and what appeared to be neural tube defects consistent with severe genetic disorders. Dr. Thatcher recommended immediate transfer to a specialized facility in Louisville for evaluation and long-term care. Evelyn refused. When Dr. Thatcher insisted the child needed treatment beyond what she could provide at home, both twins became hostile. Estelle, though not the mother, spoke as though the child belonged equally to her, referring to the infant as ours, and claiming they understood his needs better than any doctor. The physician's notes recorded his growing alarm at their behavior, how they stared at the deformed infant with expressions of satisfaction rather than concern, how they whispered to each other in a language he couldn't identify while examining the baby's abnormalities with what seemed like pride. Dr. Thatcher contacted hospital administration about his concerns. But before any intervention could be arranged, the twins disappeared from the hospital at 3 a.m. in the morning, taking the infant with them. A nurse discovered the empty room with blood smeared on the walls in patterns that looked intentional, almost decorative. The hospital filed a report with local authorities, but when deputies visited the Mercier farm the following day, the twins claimed the baby had died during the night and they had already buried him on their property, which was their right under Kentucky law. Estelle gave birth on August 19th at the farm with no medical supervision. A midwife named Clara Osborne, who lived 3 miles away, was summoned after the delivery to check on the mother and infant. Her private journal, donated to the Kentucky Historical Society decades later, contained an entry about that visit that revealed her horror. The baby girl showed abnormalities similar to Evelyn's child: misshapen skull, twisted spine, eyes that didn't align properly. But what disturbed Clara most was the twins' reaction. They cooed over the infant as though she were perfect, tracing their fingers over the deformities while smiling at each other with expressions Clara described as rapturous. Clara's journal recorded details that suggested the twins had intentionally created conditions for genetic disaster. They told her proudly that both children shared the same father, that they'd ensured this through careful planning. They mentioned that the father had a brother who had also contributed to their breeding program, speaking about human reproduction as though discussing livestock. When Clara gently suggested the baby's conditions might be related to consanguinity, the twins laughed and said that was exactly the point, that closeness in blood created closeness in soul. Over the next 2 years, 10 more children were born at the Mercier farm. Clara was called to assist with 3 of these births, each time finding herself in the presence of infants who exhibited progressively severe abnormalities, hydrocephalus, malformed organs, profound neurological deficits, conditions that in any normal circumstance would have prompted immediate medical intervention and institutional care. The twins kept every child, refusing all suggestions of hospital treatment or adoption services. Clara's journal entries became increasingly disturbed as she realized the pattern was intentional. The sisters weren't victims of unfortunate genetics, but architects of deliberate genetic catastrophe. They were breeding children who would be so damaged, so dependent that they could never leave, never integrate into normal society, never exist as anything other than extensions of their mother's twisted vision of reunification. Clara's final entry about the Mercier farm, dated November 3, 1946, contained a passage that would prove prophetic. I have delivered the 12th child today, another boy, another collection of deformities that will ensure he never walks or speaks normally. The twins have finished whatever dark work they set out to accomplish. They now have 12 souls bound to them by blood and disability. I pray I never return to that farm. There is something evil taking root there, something that grows stronger with each malformed infant they add to their collection in that basement I glimpsed once through an open door. God forgive me, I should have reported them years ago. A rural postal carrier named Vincent Dunn made deliveries to the Mercier farm twice weekly throughout the late 1940s. His testimony, given to investigators in 1978 after the hidden room was discovered, provided glimpses into the nightmare unfolding behind the farmhouse walls. Vincent described hearing children's voices from somewhere beneath ground level, muffled and distant, speaking in sounds that didn't resemble normal speech, more like rhythmic clicking and guttural noises that rose and fell in unison, as though multiple throats were producing coordinated sounds without forming words. He'd asked the twins about the children on several occasions. They always provided the same response. They were caring for disabled orphans whose families couldn't manage their special needs. The explanation seemed plausible enough in an era when institutionalization was common for severely disabled children and private care arrangements weren't heavily regulated. But Vincent noticed disturbing details that stayed with him for decades. The basement windows, small openings barely visible above ground level, were always covered with heavy fabric from the inside. On one delivery in July of 1949, Vincent arrived earlier than usual and caught movement behind the fabric before someone quickly pulled it tighter. He'd seen faces pressed against the glass, pale features that appeared swollen and malformed, eyes too large for their sockets, staring out at daylight they rarely witnessed. The faces disappeared instantly, replaced by darkness. The twins themselves became increasingly strange as the years progressed. Vincent noted they seemed to age rapidly between 1947 and 1953, their hair turning prematurely gray, their skin taking on a waxy quality as though they were slowly transforming into something not quite human. They moved in perfect synchronization, turning their heads at identical angles, reaching for objects at the same moment, finishing each other's sentences before the first had completed speaking. Most disturbing were the occasions when Vincent heard screaming from the basement, high-pitched wails that sounded like children in agony, lasting for minutes before cutting off abruptly in a way that suggested intervention rather than natural cessation. When Vincent mentioned hearing cries, the twins would smile identically and explain that the children sometimes became overstimulated and needed calming, a process that could be temporarily distressing but was necessary for their well-being. A traveling preacher named Silas Harrow stopped at the Mercier farm in April of 1951, seeking water for his horse and hoping to spread the gospel to isolated families. His account, recorded in his personal journal and later provided to researchers, described an encounter that drove him to leave Christian County permanently. He'd been invited into the kitchen while one of the twins fetched water. The other sat across from him, staring without blinking until he became profoundly uncomfortable. He heard sounds from below the floor, scraping and thumping as though multiple bodies were moving around in confined space. Silas asked about the noises. The twins smiled and said the children were playing their games, learning to move together in harmony. She offered to show him their special ones if he'd like to see what miracles God sometimes created. Something in her tone made Silas decline. As he prepared to leave, he glimpsed through a partially open door what looked like stairs descending into darkness. At the bottom, just visible in the dim light, were small figures moving in synchronized patterns, their shadows dancing on the walls in formations that seemed choreographed rather than spontaneous. The twin noticed him looking and closed the door quickly. Her expression changed from welcoming to hostile in an instant. She told Silas he should leave immediately and never return, that some holy works weren't meant for outsider eyes. As his horse pulled away from the farm, Silas heard what sounded like children singing. But the melody was wrong somehow, too perfectly unified, as though a dozen throats were producing identical notes with supernatural precision. He wrote that night that he'd encountered something pretending to be Christian charity, but was in truth something ancient and profoundly evil, wearing the mask of maternal devotion. Military records declassified in the 1990s revealed a disturbing pattern among German prisoners who had worked at the Mercier farm after their repatriation to Germany following the war's end in 1945. Of the 8 men who had been regularly assigned to the farm, 3 committed suicide within 2 years of returning home. 2 others were admitted to psychiatric institutions with diagnoses of severe psychotic episodes. The remaining 3 refused to discuss their time in Kentucky, but family members reported they suffered from recurring nightmares and would wake screaming about twisted children and witch women who stole souls. A psychiatric evaluation of one prisoner, a man named Friedrich Vogel, was conducted at a Frankfurt hospital in 1947. The translated transcript revealed testimony so disturbing that German medical authorities initially dismissed it as combat-related delusion. Friedrich described being forced to participate in what he called blood rituals, where the twins would cut their palms and mix their blood with wine, making prisoners drink while they chanted in a language that caused physical pain to hear. The sounds produced pressure inside his skull, he claimed, like something trying to force its way into his mind. Friedrich spoke of being told he'd fathered children, that his brother Jan had also fathered children with the same women, and that these offspring were being raised in darkness for a special purpose the twins wouldn't fully explain. They'd shown him the basement once, he said, opening the door just wide enough for him to see shapes moving in synchronized patterns in the dim light. Small, malformed figures that moved as one organism despite being separate bodies. The twins had whispered that this was what unity looked like, what humanity should have been before individuation corrupted the species. The most chilling portion of Friedrich's testimony concerned what happened when he tried to refuse further participation in the arrangement. The twins had simply stared at him, both pairs of eyes locked on his face with an intensity that made him feel as though his thoughts were being read and rewritten. He found himself unable to resist, his will dissolving under their synchronized gaze. Other prisoners reported similar experiences of compulsion, of feeling their autonomy stripped away when both sisters focused their attention simultaneously. Johann Vogel, Friedrich's brother, hanged himself in his family's barn in December of 1946. The suicide note he left, preserved in German police records, contained only one sentence: "I cannot bear knowing what we created in that Kentucky darkness." Another prisoner, Klaus Brenner, spent his final years in a psychiatric ward near Munich, repeatedly drawing the same image on any paper he could access. Identical twin women standing over a collection of small deformed figures, all connected by lines that suggested they were somehow linked together. Klaus would mutter while drawing that the children weren't individuals, that they were fragments of a single consciousness distributed across multiple damaged bodies. that the twins had succeeded in creating what doctors had destroyed when they separated them at birth. Medical staff noted that Klaus spoke of the children with a mixture of horror and strange pride, as though he recognized the abomination his genetic contribution had helped create, but also understood it represented something unprecedented in human experience. He described the twins' belief that severe disability wasn't a flaw, but a feature, that bodies too damaged to function independently would force souls to merge for survival, creating the unified consciousness the sisters had lost. Klaus died in 1952, but his final words to a nurse were recorded in his file. "They wanted to make gods from monsters. I think they succeeded. I dream of 12 voices speaking as one, and I wake knowing that something impossible lives in Kentucky, something that should not exist but does, and it grows stronger every year." Those children remain bound together in that lightless place. The discovery that forced official intervention came on January 23, 1953, when postal carrier Vincent Dunn arrived at the Mercier farm for his regular delivery and found the front gate standing open, the farmhouse door ajar, and no response to his calls. Concerned by the unusual circumstances, Vincent approached cautiously and heard sounds from inside that made him freeze. Children's voices, dozens of them it seemed, all speaking in perfect unison, producing a rhythmic chant in no language he recognized. Vincent retreated to his vehicle and drove directly to the sheriff's office in Hopkinsville. Deputy Carl Whitlock accompanied him back to the farm, arriving just after noon. The sounds had stopped. The house appeared deserted. When they knocked and received no answer, Carl used his authority to enter the premises for a welfare check. What they discovered would require 3 additional deputies and eventually the county social services department to fully process. The main floor showed signs of habitation but profound neglect: rotting food on unwashed dishes, mold covering the walls in dark patches. But most disturbing was the smell rising from the basement, a combination of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else Carl couldn't identify but described in his report as the scent of sickness and decay mixed with something chemical and wrong. Carl descended the basement stairs with Vincent following reluctantly behind. The door at the bottom was reinforced with metal bars and equipped with 3 heavy locks, all currently open. Carl pushed the door inward, and his flashlight beam revealed a scene that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. 12 children ranging in age from approximately 6 to 9 years old, all exhibiting severe physical deformities, confined in a windowless room with only those small beds and chains for furnishing. The children reacted to the light with synchronized movements, all 12 turning their heads at identical angles, raising their arms in unison to shield malformed eyes unaccustomed to brightness. They made sounds, clicks and guttural noises, communicating with each other in their invented language. Carl noticed immediately that they moved as a single organism. One child's shifting position triggered identical movements from all the others, as though their nervous systems were somehow connected despite physical separation. Medical examination would later reveal the extent of their conditions: hydrocephalus, spina bifida, club feet, underdeveloped limbs, cleft palates, skeletal deformations, and profound neurological deficits. But what disturbed the examining physicians most was their behavior. The children became agitated when separated, thrashing and screaming until reunited. They would synchronize their breathing, their heartbeats measurably aligning when placed in proximity to each other. Neurological scans suggested brain activity patterns that mimicked each other with precision that shouldn't occur between individuals. The walls told their own story. Thousands of scratched marks tracking years in darkness, crude drawings showing the progression of their existence. Early images depicted individual figures, but later drawings showed the figures merging together, boundaries between bodies becoming unclear, until the final images suggested a single entity with 12 heads and 24 arms. More disturbing were markings that appeared to be writing attempts in the twins' invented language, symbols that repeated across all 12 children's sections of wall with identical formation, as though the same hand had written them, despite each child being chained in separate areas. Investigators would later theorize the children had somehow taught each other to produce identical marks, coordinating their efforts to create unified messages despite isolation. The twins were nowhere on the property. Deputies searched the entire farm, the surrounding woods, and neighboring areas. Evelyn and Estelle Mercier had simply vanished, leaving behind their life's work, still breathing in that lightless basement. 12 souls trapped in damaged flesh, bound together by blood and deliberate genetic catastrophe into something that existed in the space between individual and collective, human and something else entirely. The 12 children were transported to Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a facility equipped to handle patients with severe disabilities and complex medical needs. The admission records documented what staff encountered: 12 souls who had never known life above ground, who had developed their own communication system incomprehensible to outsiders, who functioned less as individuals than as components of a distributed consciousness. Dr. Helena Crane, the psychiatrist assigned to evaluate them, produced a report that challenged fundamental assumptions about human development and identity. She observed that separating the children caused measurable physiological distress. Heart rates elevated simultaneously across all 12 when anyone was isolated. They would cry out in their clicking language, and the isolated child would produce sounds that the others would echo perfectly despite being in separate rooms with no acoustic connection. The medical evaluation revealed genetic patterns that confirmed the worst suspicions. Blood typing and what limited genetic testing existed in 1953 showed the children were the product of identical twin mothers and closely related fathers. The genetic similarity between siblings was closer to what would be expected from a single set of parents reproducing with themselves, creating levels of homozygosity that medical literature had never documented outside of extreme laboratory inbreeding experiments. Dr. Crane's most disturbing observations concerned their synchronized behaviors. The children would eat simultaneously, lifting food to their mouths in identical motions. They would fall asleep within seconds of each other, regardless of individual fatigue levels. Most unnervingly, they appeared to share sensory experiences. When one child touched a hot surface, all 12 would cry out and pull back their hands. When one received an injection, all 12 would flinch at the moment the needle penetrated skin. Staff members reported incidents that defied rational explanation. A nurse named Patricia Voss documented an event from March of 1953, where she'd quietly entered the children's ward at 2 in the morning to check on a child with fever. Before she'd made a sound or turned on lights, all 12 children sat up simultaneously in their beds and turned to face her exact position. They stared in perfect unison. 12 pairs of malformed eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her feel as though she was being examined by a single vast intelligence, rather than multiple disabled children. The county prosecutor attempted to build a case against the Mercier twins, but their complete disappearance complicated legal proceedings. A grand jury heard testimony about the conditions in which the children had been kept, the genetic manipulation that had produced them, the deliberate creation of disabilities to ensure dependency. Warrants were issued for Evelyn and Estelle's arrest on charges of child abuse, reckless endangerment, and what prosecutors termed crimes against nature, for which Kentucky law provided no adequate framework. The investigation into the twins' whereabouts produced only mysteries. No financial transactions after January of 1953. No sightings confirmed by multiple witnesses. No bodies discovered despite extensive searches. The last documented interaction with the twins was a brief conversation with postal carrier Vincent Dunn on January 20th, 3 days before the children's discovery. Both sisters had seemed agitated, Vincent recalled, repeatedly looking back at the farmhouse while telling him they were preparing for a great transformation, that their work was nearly complete. Deputies searching the farmhouse found the twins' bedroom disturbing in its own right. A single bed where both women had slept pressed together, walls covered in the same strange symbols found in the basement, an altar with 13 candles, 12 small and 1 large, arranged around a hand-drawn image of a tree with 12 branches growing from a double trunk. Dried blood stained the floorboards in patterns that suggested ritual use. And pinned to one wall, a note written in French that translators rendered as, "We return to what we were before they cut us. The children carry us forward. 12 vessels, 1 soul. The separation is finally corrected." The children remained at Waverly Hills Sanatorium, but their presence created ongoing disturbances that staff struggled to explain in medical terms. Dr. Crane's longitudinal study documented phenomena that challenged scientific understanding. The children's synchronization didn't diminish with time, but intensified. By 1955, they'd begun moving in formations that seemed choreographed despite no instruction being provided. They would arrange themselves in geometric patterns, standing or sitting in configurations that changed daily but always maintained perfect symmetry. More disturbing were reports of staff members experiencing psychological effects from prolonged exposure to the children. Nurses assigned to their ward reported dreams where they saw through 12 pairs of eyes simultaneously. Orderlies described feeling watched by an intelligence far greater than what 12 severely disabled children should possess. Several staff members requested transfers, citing an overwhelming sense that something was growing stronger within the children, something that had nothing to do with normal human development. Medical records documented the children's declining physical health, alongside their increasing behavioral coordination. The genetic abnormalities that had disabled them from birth created cascading health problems as they aged. Organ failures, immune deficiencies, skeletal deterioration that made movement increasingly painful. Yet even as their bodies failed, their connection seemed to transcend physical limitation. Children too weak to lift their heads would turn in unison when others in the group did so. The first death occurred in March of 1957. A boy whose heart had been malformed since birth finally succumbed to cardiac failure at age 10. The remaining 11 children reacted with behavior that made Dr. Crane question whether death truly separated them. For 3 days after the boy died, the others would turn toward the empty bed where he'd lain, speaking in their clicking language as though he were still present. They would leave space for him in their geometric formations, arranging themselves around an invisible 12th member. Deaths came more frequently after that. By 1960, 7 of the 12 had died from complications of their genetic conditions. The survivors maintained the same coordinated behaviors, but now they moved in patterns that included spaces for the deceased, as though the dead remained part of their collective existence. Staff members reported seeing all 5 remaining children turn simultaneously to stare at empty air, tracking movement that only they could perceive. Dr. Crane's final report, submitted 6 months before the last child died in 1965, contained observations that the sanatorium board refused to publish. She described the children as fragments of a consciousness that had never properly separated into individuals, that their mother's twisted experiment had created something genuinely unprecedented in human experience. The severe disabilities weren't failures, but integral to the design, forcing dependency that prevented individuation, keeping 12 souls bound together in a way that persisted beyond physical dissolution. The last surviving child, a girl whose spine had curved so severely she could no longer walk, died on August 14, 1965. She was 12 years old, though her body appeared ancient from accumulated damage. Her final words, spoken in fractured English she'd never been taught, were recorded by the nurse present. "We are together now, all 12, whole at last." The sanatorium staff reported that in the weeks following her death, the empty ward where the children had lived continued to produce sounds, clicking, and rhythmic breathing, footsteps in formations of 12 when no one was present. The ward was sealed and later demolished when the facility closed in 1982. The Mercier twins were never found. No graves, no confirmed sightings, no evidence of life after January of 1953. They'd simply ceased to exist in any documentable way, leaving behind only their creation. 12 genetically devastated children who'd somehow achieved the impossible unity their mothers had sought. If this story made you question what human beings are capable of creating in isolation and obsession, click the like button and subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories that history tries to forget because somebody needs to remember the victims, the horror, and the warnings these cases provide.